Hello and welcome to the top custom Hearthstone cards of the week. First up we have Explosive Surprise, Hunter Secret that reads, when a friendly minion is attacked, magnetize 2/02 Goblin Bombs to it. For just 2 mana you're getting quite a bit of value. First off, your minion gains 4 health. So if your opponent originally thought that it would only take 2 damage to kill your mech, well, now they have 4 more damage they need to deal with. On top of this, the Goblin Bomb death rattles gained means that at least 4 damage is going to go to face. But if this mech is left out, a hunter could use a number of death rattle activators to deal 4 damage every time. That could lead to a lot of damage. So clearly this card grants a lot of value for just 2 mana, but it's also pretty easy to play around. First off, there aren't that many mechs in Hunter to run. Spider Bomb is pretty common. Maybe you could run Exploitinator, maybe the Venomizer Missile Launcher combo, Zilliax. Hunter doesn't really run too many mechs, and it isn't worth running bad mechs just to get this secret to work. So a lot of the time, I think it's going to be hard to line up having this secret up with a mech on the board. And even if you get to that point, your opponent can still play around this card. They can just not attack into your mech and either ignore it or use a spell to kill instead. So unless you're running a lot of mechs and your opponent has no choice but to trigger the secret, it's going to be a bit of a tough card to include. It's just up there in terms of value with Wandering Monster when it triggers, but with the current cards, that's going to be pretty tough. I like the design, I like the card art, and maybe if Explosive Surprise is released with some other strong mechs for Hunter, it will see play. Next up is Unsavory Armor. 3 mana, 2/3 warrior minion with the battle cry, give your opponent +6 armor. When their armor breaks, summon a 3/3 scrap golem. The idea with this card is that while you give your opponent 6 extra health and armor, once you're able to remove all of your opponent's armor, your 3 mana play will now turn into a total of 5/6 stats. Against most opponents, this card is pretty decent. It's slow initially, and granting the armor could be troublesome if you're trying to set up for lethal, but getting rid of your opponent's armor is definitely doable within a couple of turns. It's not really that long term of an investment, and it could work well in a tempo deck, unless your opponent already has a lot of armor. Druid's infamous rise to armor gaining power is still relatively new if you think about Hearthstone's timeline as a whole. Unsavory Armorer would be absolute trash against Druid and any control warriors. If your opponent already has 20 armor, then you're probably not going to see that 3/3 until the late game. Even if your opponent doesn't have any armor, if you don't pop that initial 6 on the same turn, you can probably guess that they'll be up to 30 armor by the end of their turn. Unsavory Armor is just caught in a weird time where Druid is really good at gaining armor, and giving them even more just plays to their strengths. On top of this, the card doesn't really have much tempo support in Warrior. I still like the design, balancing, and the gameplay against most decks, but it's just not the right time for this card. Next up we have Sara, Avatar of Yogg-Saron. 5 mana, 5/5 neutral with the battle cry, give your Yogg-Saron immune on your turn. Hold up. If people want Yogg-Saron pre-nerf back in standard, why not let them be Yogg-Saron? I present to you, Yogg-Saron, God of Death.
Bow down before the god of death.
10 mana rogue hero card with the battle cry, cast a random spell for each spell you've cast this game. Targets chosen randomly. And with this card you also get the new hero power, Toothy Maw, a passive hero power where whenever your opponent casts a spell, a Scroll of Wonders is shuffled into your deck. It's another design of my own. I seem to be pissing excellence these days. But let me go through the rundown of my decision with this card's design. First, a lot of people were asking why this isn't a neutral hero card, and why I picked Rogue. While it would be cool to use a meme card like this in any class, I think printing a neutral hero card would actually fall into some of the same issues that Yogg and a lot of other powerful neutral cards fell into. You don't want people just throwing a hero card into any deck to make it better, because it could lead to basically every deck playing it. The inherent power level of hero cards is already pretty high, and while I'll go into this card's weaknesses, I think a lot of control decks would just slam this card in if it were neutral to try to get more value and lucky RNG. So why did I pick Rogue? Well, first, they only have one other hero card, and it's not one particularly played often. It's great in terms of value, but Rogue tends to have more tempo decks, so I thought a card like Yogg could be a nice turn 10 play for them. Now, the second thing is Rogue has draw. There's the classic Auctioneer deck to draw and also ramp up Yogg's Battlecry with a ton of spells, or there's the plethora of other draw Rogue has, including some memes. Rogue can get through their deck, cast a bunch of spells, get tons of random value from the Battlecry, and draw those Scroll of Wonders from their deck. I think there's enough meme potential to completely go off the rails with the rogue deck, but there's also some legitimate demand in the class for a hero card that can benefit faster decks. Some people were saying, why not put this in Mage? And you know, I think it could work in Mage too, but I just think the card looks better in black. The battlecry is pretty self-explanatory, it's just Yogg's battlecry, and the armor is just a number I made up because I thought it should get a bit more armor for the high cost, and to maybe protect you against any incoming harmful spells from the battlecry. Now, let's talk about this hero power, Toothy Maw. I went with the passive hero power because I actually don't want it to be very powerful, and I don't want people to be able to spam RNG spells for just 2 mana. That's what some people were recommending, a 2 mana hero power that casts a random spell on a random target. But do you know a single Hearthstone player that wouldn't press that button every single turn? I want to be able to meme with this card, but I don't want to ruin people's games on turn 10, and I think it might actually kill Crip if his opponent would be able to press a button to do something random every turn. I want the battlecry to have that big or minor effect on the board, and then be able to have the game move on from that turn. So with Toothy Maw, I want to give opponents the power to decide whether they want to deal with more RNG. I think having the passive hero power that shuffles a scroll based off of when your opponent plays a spell is a pretty nice way of doing that. Now, I'm not saying I'm wrong, but I do admit the hero power is pretty slow. Your opponent doesn't have to be scared if they play a spell that turn because there's no immediate consequence. You probably aren't going to draw a scroll that next turn if your opponent has only played 1 spell so far. Honestly, I think I did make the perfect card design again, because the point of this card isn't really the hero power. You can go in a ton of directions with it, but back to the original post that inspired this card, it's all about being able to play Yogg again, pre-nerf and without the fear of its battlecry ending early. Long live the God of Death. And let me know what you think about my design. Up next is Finkle Einhorn. You may recognize this card from The Beast or Ace Ventura, but this version of the card is a 4 mana 3/3 neutral legendary that reads, whenever a minion kills this, give it Death Rattle, summon Finkle Einhorn for your opponent. So just to clarify, when another minion kills Finkle, it's that minion that is given the Death Rattle, much like the Death Rattle of the Beast, that will then summon another Finkle for your opponent. So if your opponent keeps trading minions into Finkle, once they die, it's going to summon you another one, and the cycle can continue. But there are a couple of things to note with this card. First of all, if you kill Finkle with a weapon, or a spell, hero power, or in any non-minion way, there's nothing to give the Death Rattle to, so Finkle won't be summoned again. This means it's actually pretty easy to play around this card, but you also want to deal with it right away. If your opponent gets the opportunity to attack with Finkle into one of your minions, and Finkle dies, then your minion will now be cursed with a Death Rattle that will resummon it. And trades into Finkle, where both minions die at the same time, just end up summoning Finkle right away. That's why I also think giving Finkle Rush with Houndmaster Shaw and Hunter would be pretty good. Another thing to note is that destroying your own Finkle with one of your minions, whether it's a minion board clear or the cube, isn't a great idea because it will give your minion the Death Rattle that will then summon a Finkle for your opponent. Shit could get pretty crazy with this card, but I have to say, I think it's actually pretty weak. It doesn't take a bunch of effort to remove a 3/3, but to do so you still have to use a resource other than a minion. 4 mana for 6/6 is fantastic, but I fear a lot of the time this would only get the initial 3/3 stats. It's pretty easy to remove it for good, so even accounting for the minor inconvenience and the times where this minion actually does resummon, I think it's still pretty weak. I like the design of Finkle Einhorn, but maybe moving around some stats and the cost, or attaching this to another minion, could make it a bit stronger so it could see play. And last up we have Sleep with the Dishes. 3 mana warrior spell that destroys a minion and summons 5 1/1 plates for your opponent. So I think the idea with this card is that it's a cheap removal for warrior that also synergizes with whirlwind effects. You can destroy a powerful enemy minion for just 3 mana, and then the 5 1/1s you summon can be cheaply dealt with. While I think this is a decent use of the card, I actually think against more controlling decks, this could take advantage of enemy board space. If you look at a lot of slower decks right now, druids or warlocks, their game plan usually revolves around eventually getting tons of value spread out on their board. Take for example Hadronox. If your opponent cubes Hadronox and their entire board is flooded with taunt minions, then when you cast Sleep with the Dishes, the spell goes off before the death rattle, meaning it's going to summon a 1/1 plate, not another Hadronox. And so while summoning the 5 1/1s may seem bad, basically giving your opponent 5/5 in stats, it's actually beneficial because it's so spread out and it ends up clogging your opponent's board. Even if your opponent just has 3 other minions out on the board, it means that you're only going to summon 4 1/1s instead of 5. So not only can you take advantage of giving your opponent weak 1/1s instead of other powerful minions summoned from death rattles, but depending on how full their board is, you can put yourself in a situation where you don't really give them too much stats for the cheap removal. I think Sleep with the Dishes is a really interesting card for this meta, where for a lot of decks, the board space is pretty full. Maybe this wouldn't be your first option for removal, but being able to run this in place of Execute and Odd Warrior could be a nice pickup. That is all for this episode of the top custom Hearthstone cards of the week. If you want to learn how to make cards and where to post them, information is all in the description. Check out last week's episode if you haven't, and subscribe because I have another scripted video coming out soon. It's been a pleasure as always, thank you for watching, and until next time, ta-ta.